The cold came first, not the polite chill of autumn or the bracing snap of morning frost, but something older and more deliberate, the kind of cold that lived in stone walls and had never once considered leaving. It pressed against her skin through the thin wool of her uniform, finding every gap at her wrists and collar, settling into her bones with the patient certainty of something that had waited centuries for exactly this moment. Mira had been warned about the cold at Ashenveil Keep. She had been warned about many things. The other servants at the placement house had gathered around her the evening before her assignment was finalized, their voices dropping to the particular register that people use when they want to be believed, but also want to maintain the comfort of distance from whatever truth they're delivering. They told her about the Alpha King's wolves. They told her about the silence that hung over the eastern wing like a second ceiling. They told her, in careful and indirect language, that no one entered Ashenveil Keep as a servant and emerged with the same shape they'd carried in. She had listened to all of it. She had eaten her porridge and folded her few possessions into a canvas bag, and in the morning, she had climbed into the transport that took her north along roads that grew progressively narrower and less certain of themselves, until the forest on either side pressed close enough that branches dragged against the vehicle's roof like fingers trying to get her attention. Mira was an Omega. In the hierarchy of the pack world, that designation carried specific weight. A social and biological classification that placed her at the lower end of a system she had spent 26 years navigating with the particular skill set of someone who has learned to make herself useful enough to be kept and small enough to be overlooked. She was good at tasks, she was thorough and quiet, and she did not make demands. The placement house had sent her to 7 different households in the past 4 years, and every one of them had returned her not because of failure, but because of something they couldn't name. A discomfort they felt in her presence that they attributed to her, but that she privately suspected had more to do with them. The transport stopped at a gate of black iron that rose to twice the height of any reasonable gate needed to be, and Mira stepped out into the cold and looked up at Ashenveil Keep for the first time. It was enormous in the way that geological formations are enormous, not impressive so much as simply undeniable, a fact about the landscape that preceded human opinion and would outlast it. The stone was dark gray shading to black at the corners, where centuries of weather had concentrated their attention, and the towers at the 4 corners of the main structure rose to points that disappeared into low cloud, as though the building was attempting, in a private and ongoing way, to pierce something unreachable. The windows on the lower floors were narrow. The windows on the upper floors were narrower. She had the distinct impression that whoever had designed the building had wanted light to feel like a privilege, rather than a right. A woman met her at the gate. She introduced herself as Pell, the head of household staff, and she did this without making eye contact or slowing her stride, which meant Mira had to fall into step beside her through the gate and across a courtyard paved in stones that were slightly too uneven to be comfortable at any pace above a cautious walk. Pell was perhaps 50, with iron gray hair pulled back so severely it altered the geometry of her face, and she moved through the courtyard with the efficiency of someone who had long ago made peace with the building's indifference to human comfort. "You'll take the Omega servant's position in the East household wing," Pell said, not stopping or slowing. "You'll be responsible for the inner corridors from the main hall to the eastern passage. You will not enter the western wing under any circumstances. You will not go above the 3rd floor unless you are specifically summoned. You will not interact with the king's wolves beyond what is required to perform your duties." Mira kept pace with her. What would be required to perform my duties? Pell did stop then. She turned and looked at Mira for the first time. A long look that felt less like assessment and more like the confirmation of something she had already suspected. "Nothing," she said. "In 500 years, nothing has been required. They stay in their territory and we stay in ours, and that arrangement has worked very well." "What changed?" Mira asked. "Why are you telling me not to interact with them if it's never been an issue?" Pell looked at her for another moment and then resumed walking. "Because you smell different," she said flatly. and we don't know yet what that means. The inside of Ashenveil Keep was no warmer than the outside, but it was more complex in its temperatures. Pockets of warmth near certain walls, cold that pooled in corners and doorways. A drafting system that seemed less architectural than intentional, as though the building was breathing in a pattern it had established before any of its current occupants were born. Mira was shown her room, which was small and clean with a narrow bed and a window that looked out onto a stone courtyard rather than the forest. And she was shown the supply closets and the cleaning protocols and the meal schedules, all of which she absorbed with the practiced attention of someone who has learned that the details of unfamiliar systems are what keep you safe. She was not shown the wolves. She heard them that first night. She had been lying in the narrow bed, listening to the keep settle around her, the deep ticking of stone under temperature, the distant sound of wind finding gaps in the window casements. When a sound rose from somewhere below and to the east that she could not initially classify. It was low and layered, not a howl in the way that the words suggested, but something more deliberate and harmonic, like several voices choosing a note together and then releasing it slowly. It lasted perhaps 30 seconds. Then silence reclaimed everything with such completeness that she began to wonder if she'd imagined it. She had not imagined it. She lay with her hands flat on the rough wool of the blanket and felt the sound's reverberations still moving in her sternum, like a bell that had been struck and hadn't quite finished speaking. She thought about what Pell had said. You smell different. She had been hearing variations of that her whole life, from pack members and placement officers, and the occasional physician who'd reviewed her biological classification, Omega, technically and measurably, but with anomalies in her scent profile that no one could quite account for. Most Omegas carried a baseline scent that was soft and submissive, readable as unthreatening to any wolf higher in the hierarchy. Mira's scent was, according to everyone who had tried to describe it over the years, something else. Not threatening, not submissive either. Something that made people uncertain in ways they couldn't articulate. And uncertainty in powerful beings tends to express itself as unease before it expresses itself as anything more useful. She had learned to treat her strangeness as a fact about herself rather than a problem to be solved, and on most days that approach served her reasonably well. She began her duties the next morning before light, moving through the inner corridors of the East Wing with the soft bristled broom and the cleaning cloth, and the methodical rhythm that physical work imposed, a rhythm she had always found steadying. The East Wing's corridors were high-ceilinged and lined with tapestries in colors that had faded to a uniform, dignified dimness. Deep reds gone to brown, golds gone to amber, the figures depicted in them engaged in activities that were no longer entirely legible. Hunting scenes, she thought, or war scenes. At this distance of time, and fading, it was difficult to say whether there was a difference. She had been working for perhaps 2 hours when she first felt it. It was not a sound. It was a pressure, the specific quality of being watched that you develop the capacity to perceive when you have spent enough years in situations where being watched matters. She had her back to the far end of the corridor, working at a tapestry's lower edge with the cloth, and she felt the attention land on her like a hand on her shoulder. She did not turn immediately. She continued what she was doing for several deliberate seconds, establishing in her own mind that she was choosing to turn rather than reacting. And then she turned. At the far end of the corridor, where it opened into the eastern passage that Pell had marked as the boundary of Mira's working territory, there was a wolf. It was enormous. She understood intellectually that the Alpha King's wolves were not standard pack animals. They were ancient creatures, bonded to the royal bloodline through a magic that predated the current classification systems and did not trouble itself with ordinary size constraints. But intellectual understanding is a thin preparation for the actual visual fact of an animal, the size of a draft horse standing very still in a stone corridor and watching you with eyes the color of winter sky just before snow. Its fur was gray shading to white at the throat, and it was utterly motionless in the way that only very large and very confident things can be motionless, without any of the small compensatory movements that lesser creatures use to fill the silence of stillness. Mira looked at it. It looked at her. She was so aware of several things simultaneously. That she should probably not move suddenly. That she was past the point where not moving suddenly was going to resolve anything. And that she felt, improbably, and without any reasonable justification, entirely calm. Not the numb calm of shock, but the genuine article. A settled quality in her chest that she recognized as the absence of the low-level fear she had been carrying since she arrived. Like the relief of setting down something you'd forgotten you were holding. The wolf took one step toward her. She held her position. It took another step, then stopped. Its nostrils moved. This was, she understood, an evaluation. It was reading her scent the way a more verbal creature reads text, parsing meaning and making assessments. She let it do this. She had been read this way before, and she had learned that stillness was the only honest response, because attempting to perform anything in the presence of an animal that sophisticated was a waste of effort. Then it made a sound. Not the harmonics of the previous night, something smaller, more personal. A low exhalation that carried a note of something she could only describe as confused interest. Then it turned and walked back through the eastern passage and was gone. Mira exhaled. She looked down at the cleaning cloth in her hands and noticed that she had clenched it without realizing and carefully released it. Then she turned back to the tapestry and continued working. She did not tell Pell. She wasn't sure why, except that whatever had happened felt like it existed outside the framework of reportable incidents. Not alarming, not nothing, something in between that didn't have the right shape for a conversation about it yet. The wolves came back the following morning. Not one this time. 3 of them, appearing at the junction of the corridor as she worked. Spaced apart in a formation that felt considered rather than accidental. 2 flanking a third that was slightly larger and held its head at a particular angle. She was starting to recognize as the posture of careful attention. They observed her for perhaps 5 minutes. She worked and occasionally glanced at them, and they did not advance and they did not leave. And at the end of those 5 minutes, all 3 of them withdrew at once with the coordinated silence of a single organism. On the 4th morning there were 7 of them. On the 5th morning the 7th wolf, the one that had stood at the center of the formation since day 2, crossed the line of the eastern passage and came 3 full steps into her corridor. Mira put down the broom. This seemed important. Not the submission of lowering her gaze, which was the standard Omega response to a superior in the pack hierarchy, and which felt wrong here in a way she couldn't fully articulate, but a kind of meeting, setting aside the task and giving her full attention to what was happening. She stood and looked at the wolf. And the wolf looked at her, and the cold of the corridor sat around them both, like a held breath. Then, slowly and with great deliberateness, the wolf lowered its enormous head until its chin nearly touched the stone floor. She stared at it. She had studied enough pack history to know what that gesture meant when performed between wolves. It was not the gesture a superior made to an inferior. It was not precisely submission. It was acknowledgement, the specific movement that a wolf made when it recognized something as real and significant, when the hierarchy assessment was complete, and the result was not dominance and subordination, but something more horizontal, something that the old texts called recognition. In 500 years, she thought, nothing. She inclined her own head toward it slowly, mirroring the gesture as closely as she could with a human spine. And when she raised her eyes again, the wolf was looking at her with those winter sky eyes and making the small, low sound she'd begun to think of as its voice for confusion, for recalibration, for the noise that very intelligent creatures make when the world presents them with something that requires updating their understanding of how things work. She picked up her broom. The wolf sat down in her corridor, its enormous back against the wall, and watched her work. She had been at Ashenveil Keep for 11 days when she first saw the Alpha King. She had not expected to see him, particularly. The hierarchy of the keep was organized such that the servant staff existed at a remove from the royal household's daily life. The same physical space, different planes of occupancy, intersecting only at the orchestrated points that Pell managed with the precision of someone conducting a very slow and complicated instrument. Mira had gathered. from the careful way no one discussed him directly, that the Alpha King was not a person you encountered casually. His name was Kale. She knew this because it was impossible to work in his household and not learn it. Though everyone referred to him as the king or as his majesty or as nothing at all, using the elaborate pronoun-to-sant system that the aristocratic pack households favored as a way of demonstrating respect through linguistic distance. She knew he was old, not old in the visible way, but old in the way that certain kinds of power express themselves as depth rather than age. A quality of having been present for enough of history, that history had worn smooth some of the usual human projections onto him. She knew he had ruled the pack territories for 4 centuries. She knew he had never taken a mate, and that this was considered both unusual and, by the people who lived under his rule, inadvisable to comment on. She was in the main hall corridor on the 11th day, working at the floor near the bottom of the staircase that led to the upper floors. When she heard footsteps above her, she registered them as different from the household staff's footsteps before she could have explained why. They had a different weight distribution, a different tempo. Not faster or slower, but with a particular quality of deliberate placement, as though each step was chosen rather than automatic. She was on her knees with the floor cloth, and she stayed there, because Pell's instructions had included a specific note about the correct posture for servant staff in the Alpha King's direct presence, which was eyes down and body low, and movement ceased until he had passed. She understood the instruction, and she intended to follow it, and she was following it, eyes on the gray stone floor, as the footsteps descended. She felt him before she saw him, the same quality of attention that the wolves carried, but more concentrated and more layered. An awareness that felt ancient and precise, like the sharp smell of a storm before the sky has given any visual indication of what's coming. The temperature in the corridor seemed to shift slightly as he descended, though she knew that was probably projection. He stopped. She kept her eyes on the floor. "You're Mira," he said. His voice was low and had the quality of stone that has been worn smooth by water. Not soft, but with all the rough edges polished away into something that conveyed enormous depth. She had heard a lot of voices in her life, and she had learned to read them the way she'd learned to read most things, by paying attention and not assuming. This voice was used to being heard clearly and used to meaning exactly what it said, and neither of those qualities was arrogance. They were just facts about a voice that had had 4 centuries to become exactly what it was. "Yes, Your Majesty," she said. "Look up," he said. She looked up. He was tall. She'd expected that. The royal bloodline ran large, but the tallness was incidental to the overall impression, which was less about physical dimension and more about the specific quality of presence that she could only think of as having weight. Not heaviness, not burden, but gravitational actuality, as though he occupied space more completely than ordinary matter did. His hair was dark, and his face had the particular bone structure of the very old-blooded pack families, strong and angular, and carrying the remnants of whatever emotion it had last hosted. The last thing his face had hosted appeared to have been something complicated. His eyes were the same color as his wolf's eyes. She noticed this with a start that she managed to keep internal, the winter sky gray of them, and the particular quality of attention in them that she had begun to recognize over 11 days of being watched by his wolves in her corridor. He was looking at her the way his wolves looked at her. "My wolves have been in your corridor," he said. "Yes, Your Majesty. For the past 7 days, yes, Your Majesty." A pause. He was still looking at her with that wolf-quality attention. Reading her scent, probably. Reading whatever information she was broadcasting, at frequencies she couldn't consciously control. She remained still and let this happen, the same way she had remained still for his wolves, and she noticed the same thing she had noticed then. The absence of fear, the curious, settled feeling, as though some question she hadn't known she was carrying had been answered before she could formulate the words for it. "They have not kept it anyone in 500 years," he said. The statement had no inflection of surprise. It was a fact that he was placing in the space between them, carefully, the way you place something down when you're not yet certain of the surface. "I need you to tell me what you're doing." "I'm cleaning the corridors," she said. Something moved in his face. She couldn't quite categorize it. "That's not what I mean." "I know," she said. "I'm not doing anything to them. I'm just present. I let them look at me and I don't perform, and I don't run, and I don't push. I think they're trying to decide what I am." "What are you?" he asked. The question landed with the directness of something that had been waiting to be asked for some time. Not unkindly, just completely. "I'm an omega," she said, "with irregularities in my scent profile that no one has been able to explain." "I can explain it," he said. He said this very quietly, almost as though he was speaking to himself, rather than to her, and then he appeared to reconsider, and looked at her again more directly. "Finish your work. Don't go into the western wing. Don't climb past the third floor." "I know," she said. "Pell told me." He looked at her for another moment, and then he walked past her down the corridor toward the eastern passage without another word. She turned back to the floor. Her hands were completely steady. She noticed this with a small, private interest, and filed it away with the other things she was noticing, the growing inventory of unusual facts about Ashenveil Keep that she was accumulating with the careful attention of someone who has learned that details matter more than they appear to at first glance. She thought about what he'd said. "I can explain it." And then the way he had stopped himself and continued and left. She worked until the light in the high corridor windows shifted from morning gray to the particular pale gold of midday. And the wolf she had begun to think of as hers. Not possessively, but as a matter of the spatial grammar they had established, the one that sat in her corridor every morning and watched her work. Was at the corridor junction when she packed up her supplies. It did not follow her to the supply closet, but it sat and watched her go, and when she glanced back from the doorway it was still there. Winter sky eyes patient and alert, and she thought again about 500 years, and about what it might mean to wait that long for something, without knowing what you were waiting for. The crisis arrived on the 15th day, and it arrived in the form of Mira doing what she always did, which was to be thorough. The supply closet on the East Wing's third floor had been marked in Pell's written instructions as the outer limit of Mira's cleaning territory. The closet itself was not on the third floor. It was accessible from the third floor through a door that also had a secondary access from the fourth floor's service corridor. Mira had needed a particular cleaning solution that was stored on the upper shelf, and the lower entrance was blocked by a broken Odson shelf that hadn't been repaired yet. And so she had taken the service stairs to the fourth floor and gone through the upper door. She had gotten the solution and she was leaving, and she had gone perhaps 10 steps down the fourth floor's service corridor when she heard something that stopped her entirely. It was not the harmonics of the wolves' nighttime sounds. It was not Pell's brisk footsteps or the household staff's ordinary movements. It was a sound she had no reference for, low and rough, and with an edge of something that activated the particular attentiveness that living creatures develop for sounds that indicate pain. Not a human sound and not precisely an animal sound. Something between. Something that suggested that whatever was making it was caught between states. She stood still for 3 full seconds. Then she followed the sound. She knew she was breaking the rules. She was doing it deliberately and with clear awareness that it was a choice, and that choices of this kind had consequences in hierarchical systems. And she was doing it anyway, because the sound had the quality of need, and she did not have it in her to walk away from need. This had been true of her since childhood, and she had occasionally resented it, because it had taken her into difficult places before now. But she had ultimately concluded that it was a fundamental fact about her character and not something she was interested in spending energy fighting. The fourth floor's service corridor opened at its far end into a larger passage she hadn't seen before, lit by narrow windows on the north side that gave a view of the forest. The trees very close here, their upper branches reaching toward the window glass with the same insistent attention they had paid to the transport roof 2 weeks ago. The sound was louder here and coming from behind a door that was different from the other doors in this passage. Heavier, older, its wood dark with age and its iron fittings worked with design she recognized from the tapestries in the corridor below. Hunting or war, impossible at this distance to say which. She opened the door. The room beyond was large and cold and almost dark, lit only by the narrow windows, and it took her a moment to parse what she was seeing. There were wolves. 4 of them, she counted, lying on the stone floor in postures that did not look like sleep. 2 of them were making the sounds she had heard, small and rough and involuntary sounding, the kind of sounds made by creatures managing pain. The other 2 were still in a way that frightened her. She crossed the room quickly, crouching by the nearest wolf. The one that had first appeared in her corridor, she recognized it by the specific pattern of gray and white fur and the size and shape of its head. Up close, she could see what she hadn't been able to see from the door. The wolves were injured, not recently and not from outside force. This looked like something internal, something biological. A distress that had been ongoing long enough to show in the quality of their breathing, and the tension held in muscles that should have been at rest. "What happened to you?" she said softly. Not a question, but the verbal shape of attention. She put her hand out slowly, giving the wolf time to respond, and it turned its head and looked at her, and did not move away. She had no way to assess this properly. She was a household servant, not a healer. She knew basic first aid of the human variety, and almost nothing about the biological specifics of ancient royal bloodline wolves. She needed help, and she needed it from someone who could actually do something. And the only person in this building who qualified was the Alpha King. She went to find him. She found him instead in her. She was already thinking of it as hers, the East Wing corridor, with its faded tapestries and its stone floor and its particular quality of cold light. He was standing at the junction where the eastern passage opened into the corridor, and he was looking down the corridor with the expression of someone who has just discovered that something they thought they'd successfully contained had not stayed contained. When he saw her, he went absolutely still. "Your wolves are hurt," she said. No preamble, no honorific, and she recognized both omissions as she made them and could not locate any regret about them. "They're on the 4th floor, the room at the far end of the north passage. 4 of them. 2 are moving, 2 aren't." His expression changed. Not dramatically. He did not appear to be a person whose emotions expressed themselves dramatically in his face, which she suspected was a thing that happened over centuries to people who held power alone long enough. But something shifted behind his eyes, some composite of things that included concern, and something she could only describe as the expression of being caught. "How did you get to the 4th floor?" he said. His voice was level. "Through the service entrance from the supply closet. I needed a cleaning solution. The lower access was blocked." He looked at her for a moment with an expression that she realized was not anger, despite the fact that anger would have been the expected response to a servant breaking the clearly stated rules of the household. It was something more like the resigned acknowledgement of a person who has been moving carefully around something for a long time and has just been forced to stop. "Come with me," he said. He took the east staircase rather than the service corridor, a faster route, and she followed him up 2 flights with a speed that made his long stride difficult to match, though she kept pace. He did not look back to check if she was following. She noticed this and filed it in the same inventory as the other things. The directness, the voice, the way he'd said, "I can explain it," and then stopped. The room with the wolves was not quite as she had left it. The 2 that had been moving since she found them were now still, though their sides were rising and falling with visible effort, and the 2 that had been still were. She hoped. She committed to hoping, only deeply asleep. Kale crossed the room to the wolf she recognized, the one she'd first met in her corridor 11 days ago, and he put his hand against its side. She watched him do this, and she watched the quality of his attention as he did it, which was not the detached assessment of a ruler evaluating a resource, but something rawer and more personal, the kind of attention that lives in the body rather than the mind. "How long has this been happening?" she asked. He didn't look at her. "For about 3 months." "What is it?" "A deterioration," he said. The word came out with a weight to it that suggested it was not a medical term, but something older and more specific. When the wolves of the royal line have not bonded in a long time, they begin to experience something analogous to what happens to a working animal that stops working. The purpose they were made for, left unfulfilled, turns on itself. What purpose were they made for? He was quiet for a moment. She watched him keep his hand against the wolf's side, steady, and she thought about what it cost to maintain that kind of steadiness over a period of 3 months. They were made to recognize the king's mate, he said, to accept that person, to mark them as safe, to bind them into the pack in a way that no political arrangement or formal ceremony can replicate. He paused. They were made for that specific act of recognition, and they have not been able to perform it. Because no one has come that they could accept, she said. In 500 years, he said. No, silence filled the cold room. They've been accepting me, she said, and kept her voice very neutral, because the other option was to let it do something else, and she was not ready for that. He looked at her then, the full weight of his attention, direct and winter sky gray and carrying all 4 centuries of itself, and she felt it land on her, not as pressure, but as the same sensation she'd had in the corridor. The absence of something she'd been carrying, so long she'd stopped registering it as a weight, the peculiar lightness of being read correctly. Yes, he said, they have. You said you could explain my scent profile, she said. He stood up from beside the wolf. He was very still the way his wolves were still, without the small compensatory movements, the occupancy of space that was total and deliberate. Yes, tell me, she said. He looked at her with an expression that had layers she couldn't read all of at once. Not yet, he said. Not until I'm certain of something. Certain of what? Of whether you'd want to know. He turned back to the wolves. I need to work with them now. I'll ask Pell to have you relieved of duties for the rest of the day. She understood that she was being dismissed. She also understood, with a clarity that surprised her by its lack of drama, that being dismissed was not the same as this being finished. She walked to the door, and then she stopped. You should know, she said, that I'm not going to perform for you. If you want to understand what's happening with your wolves and with me, you're going to have to do that with the actual situation, not a version of it I've arranged for your comfort. She did not wait to see his expression. She left. The weeks that followed were not calm, exactly, but they had the quality of a period during which things that had been underground were deciding whether or not to surface. Mira continued her work. The wolves continued to be in her corridor every morning, and now in the afternoons as well, sometimes 2 and sometimes 5 and once all 8 of them, arranged in the corridor like a gallery audience, patient and attentive, and apparently finding whatever they were watching entirely satisfying. The 2 who had been still in the 4th floor room recovered gradually over the following week, and she saw all 8 in motion for the first time on a Thursday morning when she arrived at the corridor junction and found them arranged not in their usual gallery formation, but in a loose half-circle that opened toward her, like a question posed in wolf. She walked into the half-circle. She sat down on the stone floor, which was extremely cold, and she was going to have impressions on her knees for the rest of the day, and she let the wolves arrange themselves around her. The enormous warm fact of their bodies, closing the cold off in a way that was entirely different from a blanket or a fire, more fundamental, more deliberate. The warmth of something choosing to be close, rather than the warmth of something that is simply hot. This was how KL found her. She heard his step in the corridor and felt the shift in the air that preceded him now, which she had added to the inventory of things she was tracking about him. The temperature change, the particular quality of attention that arrived slightly before the man himself did. She looked up from her position on the floor, and he was standing at the corridor junction with his hands still at his sides and an expression on his face that she could not read at all, which was unusual because she had been getting better at reading him over the past 2 weeks. He stayed in the corridor junction for a long moment. Then he crossed the distance and sat down on the floor beside her, which was so surprising that she had to recalibrate her entire model of the conversation she'd thought was about to happen. They sat. The wolves sat around them. The cold was partly nullified by warm wolf mass on 3 sides. Your scent profile, he said, corresponds to a bloodline we thought had ended 300 years ago. A secondary line of the original pack, not the royal line, but something that ran parallel to it. Something that the royal line's magic was designed to recognize. She was very quiet. Designed to recognize as what? As the other half of a bonded pair, he said, the pack's original architects believed that power of the kind that passes through the royal line needed a counterweight, something that would prevent the kind of corruption that unchecked power tends to perform. The mate of the Alpha King was never meant to be a political match. It was a biological imperative, a safeguard. The wolves were built to identify that person and accept them, because the wolves' judgment could not be bought or influenced or frightened. She absorbed this. The stone floor was very cold under her. One of the wolves had put its enormous head in her lap, and she had, without thinking about it, put her hand on the warm fur of its neck. "I'm a servant," she said. "I know. I was classified Omega by every system I've ever gone through. I know. The classification system is measuring the wrong things for your bloodline. You register as Omega because the attributes the system considers dominant. Physical power, social aggression, scent that broadcasts command, are not the attributes your line carries. What you carry is different, older." He was looking at the wolf whose head was in her lap, not at her. The texts describe it as the capacity to be still enough that truth can arrive, which is a pause, not easily categorized. "No," she said, "it's not." She thought about the placement house and the 7 households and the various people who had returned her for reasons they couldn't name. She thought about the cold of the keep and the sound of wolves in the dark and the specific absence of fear she had been walking around with for 3 weeks. "How long have you known that your bloodline still existed?" "I didn't. That you specifically were. I started to suspect in the corridor, the first time I saw you, the way my wolves were watching you, the way you were watching them back." He finally looked at her. "The way I wanted to keep standing in that corridor." The words landed without drama, which made them more difficult to manage than drama would have been. "You're a king," she said, "and you've had 400 years to find this person and you didn't, and now you have a servant showing up with a mop." The corner of his mouth moved. It was the first indication she had seen of what his face might do in the direction of something lighter than gravity, and it rearranged the whole composition in a way that was, she decided, very unfair given the complexity of the conversation she was trying to have. "The placement system sends people to fill positions," he said. "I've had people arrive with mops for 400 years. Most of them haven't sat down on the floor with my wolves." "Most of them were probably warmer," she said. He looked at the wolves around them. "Yes," he said, "probably." The confrontation happened because it had to. There was no version of what was unfolding at Ashenveil Keep that didn't eventually require the thing being named to be named directly. And it arrived not through Mira's choice or Kale's deliberate timing, but through the intervention of the outside world, which has always had a tendency to make decisions about timing that the people involved would not have made for themselves. A delegation arrived from the Southern Pac territories on a Tuesday 3 days after the conversation on the floor. Mira saw them arrive from the 3rd floor window as she worked. 6 people in the formal dress of the Southern hierarchy, accompanied by a woman who wore the rank indicators of a high-order alpha female. The delegation was formal, and the reason for it was not immediately available to Mira. But Pell's expression when she passed Mira in the corridor that afternoon had the compressed quality of someone managing significant information. And by evening, the household staff's conversation in the kitchen carried enough fragments for Mira to construct the shape of it. The Southern Pac's high alpha female was named Sarah. She had been in negotiation with Kale's advisors for the past year regarding a political alliance that had at its center a proposed mating bond. Political in the explicit and fully admitted sense. Arranged between 2 powerful bloodlines for strategic reasons, and entirely legitimate within the pack governance system that had replaced the older biological imperative model centuries ago. Most people in the pack world had moved on from the idea of fated bonds and ancient bloodline resonance, and the wolf's judgment as a sacred instrument. Those things were history. They were texts in archives that most people had not read. They were the kind of lore that you mentioned respectfully, and then set aside in favor of the systems that actually ran the world. Mira spent the evening cleaning the 2nd floor corridor and being very precise about what she was feeling and what she was doing with it. What she was feeling was complicated, and she was not going to pretend it wasn't. She had 3 weeks of corridors and morning wolves and cold floors, and one conversation that had rearranged several of her most deeply held assumptions about who she was and what she was doing in the world. She had not made any decisions. She had not been asked to make any decisions. She had been given information about a system she hadn't known she was part of, and she was carrying that information through the corridors of a very cold keep with a mop, which was, she decided, essentially the same as what she had been doing all along. She was at the Eastern Corridor junction when she heard him behind her. She turned. He was in the main hall doorway, and the expression on his face was the one she had been unable to read. The one with layers she was still cataloging. And he had a quality of being under pressure that was entirely different from his usual, contained stillness. Not less composed, more so, in the way that compression is not the same as ease. "You know about the delegation," he said. "Enough," she said. "I need you to understand something," he said. He crossed the hall toward her with the deliberate step she recognized, each step chosen rather than automatic, and stopped several feet from her with the wolves, the two who were usually in her corridor evenings, appearing from the eastern passage and arranging themselves somewhere between him and her, in a way that was not quite blocking either of them. "The negotiation has been ongoing for a year. The Governance Council expects an outcome. Sarah is not," began again. "She is not responsible for arriving here at this specific time." "I know that," Mira said. "And you are not. What is happening with my wolves, what I told you about your bloodline, none of that obligates you. I need to be clear about that. You were not asked to come here for this purpose. You were sent here to clean corridors. Whatever my wolves have decided, and whatever the old texts say about bloodlines and purpose, you are a person and not a Kale," she said. He stopped. The sound of his name in her voice, unadorned and without the honorific, did something to the air in the space between them. "I know I'm not obligated," she said. "I've spent my whole life having things decided about me by systems I wasn't part of. Placement houses and classification records and households that didn't know what to do with me. I'm not interested in trading one system for another one." She looked at him steadily. "What I'm interested in is what's actually true." "What do you mean?" he said. "I mean," she took a breath. The cold of the corridor was familiar now, not hostile. The particular cold she had come to associate with this specific stone at this hour of the evening. "I mean that your wolves have been sitting with me every morning for 3 weeks, and I feel more at home in this corridor than I have felt anywhere in my life. I mean that you sat on the floor with me and talked to me the way people talk when they're not performing for anyone. I mean that every conversation we've had has felt like the continuation of a conversation we started somewhere before I arrived here." She paused. "And I mean that none of that is the old texts and the bloodlines talking. That's me. Specifically me, telling you what I notice." He was very still. "The delegation," she said. "What are you going to tell them?" "I don't know yet," he said. "I've spent 3 weeks not knowing. I've spent 3 weeks trying to determine whether what I'm experiencing is the ancient mechanism of a biological system I was built to operate within, or whether it's something I'm actually choosing." He looked at her with the winter sky eyes, direct and entirely serious. "I don't know how to tell the difference. I've never had anything I wanted to tell the difference with before." She held his gaze. She was very aware of the wolves between them and around them, the warm mass of their presence, the quality of their attention, which was different now from the observing attention of the early days. More settled, more certain, the attention of creatures who have finished the evaluation and arrived somewhere. "That's the question, isn't it?" she said quietly. "Whether the thing that was designed and the thing that is chosen can be the same thing." "Yes," he said. "I think they can," she said. "I think the design points you towards something, but it doesn't make the thing happen. The thing that happens is—" She stopped. She stopped and looked for the right words and found them in the most honest place she could reach. "The thing that happens is what we've actually been doing for 3 weeks. And I don't know what to call that yet, but I know what it feels like." He crossed the remaining distance between them. He did it without the deliberateness of his usual step. This was not chosen the way his steps were usually chosen. Or if it was chosen at a speed that bypassed the usual machinery of decision. He stopped just within reach and looked down at her, and she could feel the warmth of him over the cold of the corridor. A warmth that felt as specific and deliberate as his wolf's warmth. Not ambient, but directed, chosen. "I need to speak to the delegation tomorrow," he said. "And I need to do it with complete information about what I'm choosing. Which means I need to ask you something, and I need you to give me a real answer." "All right," she said. "Are you choosing this?" he asked. "Not the bloodline, not the wolf's judgment, not the system you were born into. You, Mira, specifically standing in this corridor with a mop, are you choosing to stay?" The question sat in the cold air between them. She thought about the placement house, and the narrow beds, and the 7 households that had sent her back. She thought about the morning of her first day, arriving through the black iron gate, into the courtyard that was too uneven to walk comfortably, and the cold that had come first before anything was named. She thought about a wolf lowering its enormous head until its chin nearly touched the stone, and the way she had known, the way she had genuinely known, without needing to perform knowing, exactly what to do in response. "Yes," she said. "I'm choosing to stay." His hand came up to the side of her face, and it was careful and warm, and it rested against her jaw, with the quality of something that has waited a long time to make contact with the thing it was always moving toward. And she let her face turn slightly into it, the way the wolves turned toward her hand. Not because she was performing acceptance, but because it was true. One of the wolves made the small, low sound, the one she thought of as confusion or recalibration, the noise of updating the model of how things work. But softer now, she thought, less confused. The climax arrived in the morning. The delegation from the Southern Pack was assembled in the formal receiving room on the second floor. And Mira knew this because the household staff's movement patterns had reorganized themselves around it. In the way that staff movement always reorganized around formal events, the particular busy quiet of people keeping out of the way with intent. She was in her corridor, working. Because her corridor was her corridor, and her work was her work, and she was not going to change either of those things on the basis of political anxiety. But she was listening. Kale met the delegation in the receiving room, and she heard none of the words, obviously, but she heard the quality of voices, formal, structured, the rhythm of official exchange. It lasted perhaps 40 minutes. Then there were footsteps on the second-floor landing, and then other footsteps, and then a silence. She was polishing the wall fixture near the middle of the corridor when the door at the far end opened and Sarah entered. She was tall and controlled in the way of someone who has spent years managing the intersection of high biological status and political necessity. And she was very beautiful in a particular fashion that Mira recognized as the specific beauty of people who are used to being the most important person in any room they enter. Absolute in its confidence, its own justification. She walked into the corridor with an alpha's unthinking possession of space, and she stopped when she saw Mira. She looked at Mira the way she looked at everything else in her immediate environment, with quick, accurate assessment. "You're the servant," she said, not dismissively, exactly, factually. "Yes," Mira said. Sarah's nostrils moved slightly. She was reading the scent, the same way everyone did. And Mira watched her process it, and saw the moment when the comfortable category she had prepared for Mira did not accommodate what she was actually receiving. Her expression did not change significantly, but something in it reorganized itself. "He's not going to accept the proposal," Sarah said. It was not a question. It had the quality of something that had just finished becoming true while she was standing here. "I can't speak for him," Mira said. "You don't have to," Sarah said. She was looking at Mira with an expression that Mira could not quite read. Not hostility, something more complex. The expression of someone revising a calculation and finding the revision more interesting than the original. "My advisors have been telling me for 6 months that the king's wolves were unwell. They didn't say why," she paused. "They also didn't tell me he'd taken an Omega servant." "He didn't take me," Mira said very carefully. "I was assigned by a placement house." "Yes," Sarah said. "And you've been cleaning his corridors for 3 weeks, and his wolves have accepted you, and he was in this corridor last night, instead of preparing for my delegation's arrival." A slight pause. "I'm not angry," she added, and the addition had the quality of a clarification rather than a reassurance. I'm recalculating. The alliance your territory needs, Mira said. Is it specifically a mating bond? Or is it the political access the mating bond would provide? Sarah looked at her for a moment with an expression that sharpened into something approaching genuine interest. The access, she said, primarily. Then there may be other structures, Mira said, that don't require the bond. Yes, Sarah said slowly. There may. She looked at Mira with the concentrated attention of someone who has realized that a conversation they thought was about one thing is actually about something more interesting. You're unusual, she said. I've been told, Mira said. Sarah left the corridor. Her footsteps retreated down the second-floor landing with the same deliberate quality they'd arrived with, but altered, moving faster, with a different intent, as though she'd been handed a different problem and found it more tractable than the one she'd arrived with. Mira went back to work. Cale came to her corridor an hour later. He came quietly, and he sat down on the floor with his back against the wall, in the space where his wolves usually sat, which was very close to where she was working, and she glanced at him and continued what she was doing. I told the delegation that I would not be accepting the proposal, he said. I know, she said. I also told them that if what Sarah's territory needs is a formal treaty rather than a political bond, my council would be willing to negotiate terms. He paused. Sarah was, unexpectedly, already open to this conversation. I may have had a brief word, Mira said. He looked at her. She came to the corridor, Mira said. We talked. You negotiated an alternative political structure with the High Alpha of the Southern Pack in the East Wing corridor, he said. I raised a possibility, she said. She's the one who'll negotiate it. He was quiet for a moment, and then he made a sound she hadn't heard from him before. Low and brief, and with the quality of something releasing, something that had been held for a long time, under careful management, finally allowed to set down its weight. She looked at him, and his expression had done the thing she'd seen the edge of before, the corner of the mouth, but more fully this time, a real warmth in the winter sky eyes that transformed the whole gravity of his face into something she had no prepared category for and was going to need time to properly understand. Yes, she said. I need you to know, he said, that I have been managing this building and this territory and this bloodline's obligations for 400 years, and in that time I have not once sat on a stone floor in a corridor. I know, she said, and I have not once said I can explain it, and then not explained it because I was frightened of the answer. I know that too, she said, and I have never had a servant tell me that she would not perform for me, and then absolutely follow through on that commitment in every subsequent interaction. He was looking at her with the full gravity and the warmth both, the combination she was going to need time to catalog. You are the most entirely yourself person I have ever encountered in 400 years. That's the Omega with irregular scent profile talking, she said, and she heard the slight unsteadiness in her own voice and decided she was going to allow it because pretending it wasn't there would be the kind of performance she had specifically committed against. No, he said. It's me, specifically, telling you what I notice. She heard her own words back in his voice and felt them land in her chest with a warmth that had nothing to do with wolves or stone walls or the biological fact of ancient bloodlines recognizing each other. It was more specific and more personal than any of that. It was exactly what she had said it was, the thing that was actually happening between two specific people in a cold corridor, which was both more ordinary and more extraordinary than any ancient system could have predicted. She set down the cloth. She crossed the distance between them, and she sat down beside him on the cold floor the way she'd sat down on the cold floor 3 weeks ago when the wolves arranged themselves around her, with the same quality of choosing that she had chosen then. And he reached over and took her hand, which was the simplest gesture and the one that landed the hardest. Just the warm, specific fact of his hand around hers in the cold corridor air. The wolves materialized from the eastern passage one by one, and then in a cluster, all 8 of them, and arranged themselves around the 2 humans sitting on the floor, with the efficiency and silence of a system, completing a function it had been designed for and had waited 500 years to perform. The first wolf, the one with the gray and white pattern and the winter sky eyes that matched the man beside her, put its enormous head across both their laps simultaneously. Not hers and not his, but both. The gesture of a creature that had resolved its long assessment and arrived at the only conclusion the evidence supported. She felt the moment differently than she expected to. She had expected it to feel like revelation, like the loud arrival of something enormous and destined, which was how all the old texts described the bonding recognition, the mythological weight of it. What it actually felt like was quieter and more true. It felt like the particular quality of being exactly where you are supposed to be, not because a system pointed you there, but because everything you actually are has pointed you there. The specific accumulation of yourself, all the things that made you unusual and unclassifiable and difficult for every previous household to accommodate. Finding the exact shape of place that required precisely those qualities and no others. It felt like arriving. She turned her head and looked at him, and he was looking at her with the same expression, the gravity and the warmth and something underneath them both that was older and more personal than either. The expression of a man who has been moving through 4 centuries of careful management and enormous responsibility, and has just, for the first time, located the thing that he could lay that weight beside without losing it or being crushed by it. The thing that was neither escape nor surrender, but actual partnership. Now, he said very quietly, tell me what you want. She thought about all the years of placement houses and thin wool uniforms, and learning to make herself useful and small. She thought about the cold that came first, before anything was named. She thought about wolves lowering their enormous heads in the old gesture of recognition, and the way she had known, without performance, exactly how to answer. I want to stay, she said. I want this corridor and these wolves and this conversation we keep having, that feels like the continuation of something. I want to know what 400 years of being you has taught you, and I want to tell you what 26 years of being me has taught me, and I want to see what those 2 bodies of knowledge make together. She paused. And I want to be warm. I want a better uniform. This one is not adequate for the temperature of this building. He laughed. It was low and genuine, and it rearranged his face entirely, took the centuries of careful management and dissolved it briefly into something purely present, purely here. And she thought she could spend a significant portion of her life working to produce that sound again and find it entirely worthwhile. He reached up and unbuttoned the heavy outer coat he wore over his formal clothes. He put it around her shoulders without ceremony, without asking if she wanted it. In the way you give someone something you can see they need. And it was warm with his warmth, and smelled of pine and stone and winter, and something older that she was still learning to name. Better, she said. Better, he agreed. The resolution that followed was not dramatic in the way of epic endings. It did not arrive in a single moment, but in the accumulation of days and then weeks, the way that real things arrive, incrementally and specifically, with the texture of actual life rather than the clean arc of story. The Southern Pax delegation departed 3 days later with a proposed treaty that Sarah's council would review, and the rumor that moved through the Pack territories afterward, that the Alpha King's wolves had finally accepted someone after 500 years, moved with the weight of things that people have been waiting to hear, things that confirm some belief they held in the inarticulate part of themselves that they had not been certain was sound. Pell came to Mira on the 4th day and stood in the East Wing corridor with the particular posture of a woman who is revising a significant assessment and managing that revision with dignity. She informed Mira that her duties would be restructured and her quarters relocated to the Upper East Wing, which had better light and its own fire, and that she would be provided with a proper wardrobe appropriate to her new position. She said this with complete efficiency, and only the slightest indication of the scale of reorganization that had taken place in her understanding of the previous 3 weeks. And Myra adored genuinely because Pell had been doing her job exactly as it was designed and had not done anything wrong. The wolves were never far. She woke in the mornings to the sound of them in the corridor outside her new room, which, while was warmer, with the particular contentment of creatures whose purpose has been restored to them. The wolf she thought of as hers. She was careful and consistent about the possessive being emotional rather than material. This animal was no one's possession, would position itself outside whatever room she was working in with the settled attention of a guardian who has decided the assignment is permanent. She and Kale developed the habit of evenings in the library. It was not a dramatic habit, and it did not need to be. He had 4 centuries of reading to share with her, and she had the particular clarity of someone who had never been given authority to being her farm, and had therefore developed an unimpeded relationship with honest observation. And these 2 bodies of knowledge turned out to make something productive together, as she had predicted. He showed her the old texts about her bloodline, and she read them with the interested detachment of someone learning a fact about their own history rather than receiving an instruction about their own future. And she told him what it had been like to be Mira at 15, and Mira at 20, and Mira at the placement house in the years that preceded Ashenveil Keep. And he listened in the way she had come to trust him to listen, completely and without any investment in the story, coming out differently. They spoke carefully and honestly about what a bond between them would mean, not abstractly, not in the terms of the old texts, but practically and specifically. What she was choosing and what she was not choosing, what she needed and what was non-negotiable, what he needed and what he was prepared to lay down. Conversations happened over weeks, not days, and they were not always smooth, because 2 people with this much individual history between them do not arrive at shared ground without the occasional honest collision. She told him when he retreated into the formality of 4 centuries and stopped letting her actually see him, and he acknowledged it and came back. He told her when her self-sufficiency became a wall rather than a quality, and she acknowledged it and let him in. The formal bond was witnessed in the library on a Thursday evening with no ceremony except the wolves present, and the fire burning, and the winter cold at the windows, doing its usual patient work of making everything inside feel deliberate and chosen. The bond worked the way the old texts said it would, not as a loss of self but as an expansion, a quality of knowing and being known that felt less like magic and more like the most natural extension of what they had already been doing for months in the East Wing corridor with a mop and a cleaning cloth, and the accumulated weight of 8 ancient wolves waiting to do the thing they were made for. She kept the corridor. This was not negotiated or requested. It was simply true, in the way that the things that are most essentially you remain true, regardless of what else becomes true around them. She walked it in the mornings, sometimes with the wolves loose around her and sometimes alone, and the cold was familiar now in the way that the cold of a place you belong to is familiar. Not hostile, not indifferent, but specific and real, the temperature of her particular life, and she had learned a long time ago that belonging to a place means accepting its specific cold along with everything else. The first morning of spring that year, she stood at the junction of the East Wing corridor and the eastern passage with weak pale sunlight coming through the north windows, and the wolves spread out around her in the loose half-circle they had formed on the morning. She first sat down on the floor with them, and she looked down the corridor at the faded tapestries and the gray stone floor, and felt the quality of stillness that the old texts had called the capacity to be still enough that truth can arrive. And the truth that arrived was entirely ordinary and entirely sufficient, the simple, specific truth of a person standing in the place that required exactly her, in all her unclassifiable irregularity, and everything that had made 7 households uncertain, and 1 ancient king, finally certain. Kale came into the corridor from the eastern passage and stood beside her in the spring light, and the wolf who was hers in the emotional, rather than material sense, leaned its enormous gray and white body against both their legs simultaneously with the profound satisfaction of a very old creature that has completed the thing it was designed for, and found that the completion was better than the design had promised, and Mira leaned slightly into the warmth at her side and stayed.